Alrighty, now we're live. Hey, everybody, it's Friday. Daniel's here, Scott's here, I'm here. Did you guys know that time zones exist?
I've heard that they are a thing. Although when I went to China, they are not a thing in China. So.
Yeah, so sorry about that, everybody. Apparently, if you're on East Coast time and you just schedule it for 10 a.m. like you normally do, and then you fly back to the West Coast, you wake up at 7 a.m. and everybody goes, hey, where are you?
Where's your live
What
stream?
do you mean, where am I? We got 3 hours. All right, so that's my bad. That's my bad. Sorry, everybody. But like I said, Daniel's here. Scott's here. Scott, we haven't had you on the show in a while. How's it going?
Yeah, glad to be back. Glad to be in Huntsville for a Friday. Haven't done that for a while.
Yeah, you've been traveling like a madman. So
a road warrior over there.
We'll get into what you see, what you hear, what's been going on. We'll do some housekeeping real quick. Summit 7 Live, Colorado Springs, March 20th, which is next week. It's already almost the end of March, which is crazy.
Wow, that's crazy.
So we'll be in Colorado Springs. It'll be Jason Sprosser and myself half a day doing breakfast, lunch, hanging out. And we'll put out a bunch of great information, hopefully answer everybody's questions. Supposed to be somewhere around 40, 50 people. So plenty of time to get to everybody's questions, thoughts, comments, concerns. Not a big event. And yeah, should be a great time. I think there's still some spots left. So you can check that out. And CS2 virtual registration is now live as well. So if you can't make it in person to CS2 Reston, you can catch the virtual stream. And we'll be in the chat and everything like we always are. So you can check that out too. Lots of cool stuff coming up. Let's talk about what you've been doing, Scott. You've been on the CMMC budget roadshow, whistle stop train tour off the back of the caboose, waving to the people as you go by.
It's been a month or so. It's been busy. Yeah, first started out with Ride a Boom out in Las Vegas. Out there with with that team, they do a great job putting on a conference. Had some great conversations out there around security and incident response and all those kinds of great topics. And then headed down to Tampa for CUI. Matt and Fernando put on a great show down there. Got to do the presentation around IT and CMMC budgeting, which got great reviews. Had great feedback from it. Had great conversations afterwards, and then went to the Hyporia event that was actually yesterday that, Jacob, you and I were at. Good event there, pretty good turnout, and did it again there. Different audience, again, good feedback on it. And one of the things I'd love to get feedback on, from any of you that have seen that presentation, I would love to see, where do you want to take that presentation next? Where do you want to see that presentation expand? How can I do some additional research and provide additional information that you guys may want to see? I'm looking for, what would provide value to you guys out there that are looking at, how do we budget for this? How do we plan for this? I want to continue to add and expand that presentation as we continue to go here. So any feedback you want to send me on LinkedIn or maybe even here in the comments on the live stream, would love to hear that. So
I'm curious, Scott, I know you've given this a few times now. The numbers that we've presented, are they high? Are they low? What's the industry receiving it as? Are they like, man, implementation cost us a lot more, or the ongoing support? I'm just curious, kind of the overall.
It's been a little bit of a mixed bag, actually. When I was at CUI-Con, I had a number of people during the session said that they had spent significantly more than what we were presenting from a numbers standpoint. Yesterday, I had one gentleman who mentioned a couple cost-saving areas that he was able to do, controlling scope, enclave, that kind of thing, and was able to do it on the lower end or even below some of the numbers that I had presented. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. However, it all comes back to, and I think we've had this conversation a lot. It all comes back to scope. How are you scoping your CUI boundary? And larger scope equals larger cost. And that is basically what it comes down to.
Yeah, makes sense. Because I mean, some people are like, we can get CMMC compliant in $6,000 in 30 days. I saw that on LinkedIn the other day, and I'm like, I don't think that that's right.
The 6-minute abs, the 6-minute
That's
abs
right.
of CMMC.
Yeah.
Take it from me, everybody. The 6-minute abs program does not work.
That is a $500 laptop that is locked in a closet is the CUI boundary.
That is exactly what it is. A
Yeah.
Best Buy special.
Well, yeah, this is the thing that Ryan Bonner has said for years, where he's like, most people start out on this journey and they're like, oh, we need a gap assessment. We need a gap assessment.
Mm-hmm.
He's always made the case that people need a scope assessment more than a gap assessment, because a gap assessment assumes that the gaps that you have are through the scope as it should exist. And that's, like you said, Scott, the number one driver of cost isn't gaps, it's scope. Yeah. And so the gaps are relatively easy to remediate, right? Those are technical solutions, whatever. But changing your scope can be very difficult, because changing data flow around your organization, sometimes you can't even do it. Sometimes you can. It just depends.
Yeah. And, the worst thing that you can see somebody do is create a really tight scope and then not use it to actually process their CUI. We're seeing too much of that out there in the ecosystem right now.
Yeah.
That's the hard thing when I go in and pitch or have the conversation around enclaves, is like, it's a great solution if you use the solution, but in the back of your mind, you wonder, like, how many people are actually using this and transforming their data flow to fit in enclave versus just having a beachhead to check the box, So it's very interesting. You wish that assessors were also like CUI hunters, and they were making sure that your boundary was actually accurate. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But, that's the thing about CMMC, right? Is that when a CMMC assessment begins, the idea, right, the whole premise is that all of that stuff has already been determined, right? Your agreements with your customers, what's in your contracts, what requirements are not applicable or applicable, what you've negotiated with the CIO to be in your environment or not. All that stuff is set, and they're just there to verify what's been going on. So
Daniel,
a lot of stuff gets sort of applied to CMMC as CMMC's problem. They're like, we're just showing up to check the work.
That's right.
This is CMMC's fault.
Daniel, I think you might want to pitch a show to Discovery Channel, CUI hunters, in the same way as Ghost Hunters.
It'd be like River Monsters.
It'd be like the Ghost Hunters.
Or River Monsters.
Ryan Bonner and I with those backpacks on with the plasma, it's like.
Did you know that the show River? Fun fact, everybody. Quick tangent. Did you know that River Monsters stopped being a show because the guy on the show caught all of the crazy river monster fish around the world? They ran out of like scary legendary fish to catch, so they just stopped the show. He's like, "There's no more fish to catch."
Oh well, I guess that's one way to end the show.
There you go. Speaking of monsters lurking, Daniel, easy, simple question, real quick: is my managed service provider a cloud service provider?
Maybe.
How hard could it be?
How hard could it be? So the DoD released this publication. Let me go ahead and just share my screen because I'm a big fan of show and tell. This is on the DoD CIO's website, and they actually have a little section in here. Is my ESP a CSP, external service provider? They also have, is my MSP a CSP?
Question submitted by the DoD, apparently.
Yeah, it's like, okay, well, at least they're using some language that the industry understands now, like MSP, which,
is huge progress.
Huge progress. Words are hard for all of us, so we appreciate the effort. Long story short, an MSP for the majority of the people is not going to be a CSP. So even if the MSP is reselling a software subscription, but that software subscription is technically owned and under the name of the client, then MSP is not a CSP. However, thank you, James. The DoD answer is, it depends. I love James. Big fan of you here on the show, James. If the MSP, let's see here, contracts with the CSP and further modifies the basic cloud service, then the MSP is a CSP. So if you're deploying a piece of software in a SaaS type environment, like a multi-tenant deployment of something and servicing multiple clients through that, and you're modifying the initial scope of that cloud provider, then yes, you very well could be in scope and end up needing your FedRAMP moderate or equivalency. And we all know how the DoD feels about equivalency these days. So it's a real thing, but it's also very hard to get and very hard to maintain. So
one of one of the big places I've seen, MSPs get in trouble with this is a really common service that many MSPs offer is backup.
Yes.
And, if you're backing up, an environment into, the MSP's infrastructure, that turns that MSP into a CSP at that point. So that is a really, really common capability that MSPs offer all over the country. And you don't really know where they're storing it. It could be stored in their own data center. It could be stored in an outsourced data center. It could be anywhere. And so that is certainly one that you need to really pay attention to.
Yeah, it is one that you will easily get tripped up on, because this little slide deck has a lot of really good tidbits in it, especially like
there's
VDI.
A bunch of slide decks that they updated early this year on their CIO page. We'll put the link in there for you real quick, John. But yeah, if anybody's just listening and you can't get to the links, if you just Google CMMC CIO mill, it'll take you right to the website, and under resources, it's got all of the PowerPoints, assessment guides, scoping guides, hashing guides, all that stuff. And there's a handful of new slide decks that are in there. So,
yeah, they have some other cool stuff. The VDI stuff, they clarify that tokens and certificates are allowed for redirection into VDI environments. Some people had questions on that instead of all redirection. And what was another really good one? Oh, this was interesting. IaaS implications. So infrastructure as a service, what separates from a CSP versus an MSP, basically what's the definition of a CSP in this scope? Can end users spin up things on demand, up and down, things of that nature? So anyways, pretty good slide deck. It can be just a hair confusing on some of the MSP CSP language. It sounds like maybe an MSP can do more than maybe they can. But always point back to the actual rule and the actual scoping guidance. These are all supplemental to kind of help clarify and educate the industry. So if you have confusion, go there or email the CMMC PMO office or the DoD CIO's office, and they will be happy to respond. So,
absolutely. All righty, let's see here. Okay, so a while ago, about a year ago, actually, if anybody remembers, we talked about a metric called PALT, or Procurement Administrative Lead Time. Let me share my screen here. And we did a podcast on this. We talked about this quite a bit, and I really like this metric because procurement administrative lead time is the time between a solicitation going out for bids and the time that it is actually awarded as a contract to an offerer, right? So the time period is what's known as procurement administrative lead time. And what a lot of people don't know is that since about 2019, Congress has been hounding the DoD to shorten the PALT timeframe to the greatest degree possible. And they've been extremely successful. And apparently, over the last couple of years, the median time to award after a solicitation goes out has dropped by 20%. And it has gone all the way down to 32 days, 31 days, basically like a month, right? So this is the best chart in this report. It's actually the background of the podcast thumbnail. So if you're looking for the podcast that we've done this, you can sort of look for this picture. Most people, 99% of people, are going to be these gold colored numbers here. These are awards that are $250,000 to $50 million. If you're below $250,000, they actually don't track this because they're so fast in terms of how often they get awarded. Most people are not going for $50 million plus direct award contracts in the DIB. And so you can see sort of by component, by award type, what the trend has been over time for these PALT timeframes. So when we were at the Hypori event, I was we've done this comparison before, but if the amount of time that it's going to take you to implement your controls, go through your assessment, and get your certification is longer than the amount of time that it takes your customer to solicit an award and then award the contract, you have a problem, because CMMC is a condition of contract award. So you can bid on the solicitation. It's not a requirement to bid, but you have to have the cert in order to take award. If it takes you 12 months to go from scratch to certified, and it takes them 32 days to go from solicitation to award, then you have to start 11 months before the bid comes out. Does that make sense? Right. So the math is you have to like preload all of your preparation. And that makes total sense because CMMC isn't the one that's imposing the requirements on you. And so a lot of people don't know that. What we hear pretty often is people rationalizing inaction and sort of non-compliance because they say, well, I'll get started as soon as I see CMMC in contracts, which means you're going to see it in solicitations. And a lot of those companies don't have 6 or 12 months of runway where they can just miss awards. And so if in phase 1, which is going to start later this year, summertime, late summertime, the DoD starts putting these requirements into solicitations, or primes start officially putting it into their solicitations, then you decide to get started, you're going to be upside down by 6, 12, 18 months. Because the other two factors to consider there are implementation backlogs, how long it takes your MSP partner to get you kicked off, which we currently have a backlog right now for when we can get people started, and then assessor backlogs in terms of what the lead time is on getting on their books. So a lot of people, as we've seen, Daniel, everybody's like, there's not enough assessment capacity. All the C3PAOs are booked. And then the C3PAOs are showing up to do assessments for people that booked stuff a year ago. And they're not ready. They're getting CMMC. They're getting false starts because their implementation.
Their backlog is starting to go away because they've had so many false starts. They could start an actual new assessment within a few weeks. We have several partners that have come and told us that. What I talked to somebody yesterday, a C3PO that was telling me the majority of the people that he's had conversations with, back to your point, Jacob, was people that are going to try and pursue the MAPS contract. So MAPS, the RFP that was released the day after the 32 CFR. And I thought that was kind of interesting. It's like there are people already trying to take that position to ensure, and they know that a contract is coming, but very few people are going to know that far in advance, like if they're going to require CMMC or not. That they're going to end up with that shorter window from solicitation all the way through award. And so anyways, I thought that was pretty interesting.
The MAPS contract came up yesterday in a conversation we were having up at the Hypori event. Companies getting ready for, the MAPS contract and wanting to be, ready, certified for that because it showed up in that solicitation. So with that many companies just on that one solicitation, basically filling up a lot of the pipeline. And that's just one contract. It's really interesting. Yeah.
Hey, James, thanks for the kind words for the presentation. Feel free to tell people about the two metrics. So long story short, I started calling it CALT. I will have to come up with a better name. CMMC assessment lead time versus procurement administrative lead time. So if your CALT window is longer than your customer's PALT window, you got a problem, right? So you got to preload your assessment preparation. CALT versus PALT. I don't think that's marketing's going to hate that term. It doesn't sound great, but it's you get it. You get it. CALT, PALT. We're whiteboarding here. We're whiteboarding.
Yeah. Well, I mean, talk a little bit about what that actually means. I mean, what are the three components that make up CALT? I mean,
so it would be the implementation backlog, the implementation timeline, and then your assessment backlog is sort of the three factors that go into what's going on, which, we've seen implementation backlogs for some people, are a couple months. Some people who are MSPs in the ecosystem have their implementation backlogs that are out to the end of the year and beyond because there isn't as much implementation capacity in the ecosystem as is required.
Right. What were you saying, Daniel?
I was just saying, I've heard some vendors that are 8-9 months out backlog wise, even to be able to get started, which is pretty wild to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty, let's see here. So people are talking about 171 Rev 2, 171 Rev 3. It's a very common question. We got this at Hypori yesterday, and people were saying, which version do I have to assess? You have to implement and be assessed against NIST SP 800 171 Revision 2 for the subset of controls verified at CMMC level 1 and the full set of controls verified at CMMC level 2. And the reason why you have to get verified against revision 2 rather than the most current version, which is revision 3, is that when regulations are created and they go through the rulemaking process, there's all sorts of legal requirements where they have to try to estimate cost, impact, time, so on and so forth. And if they don't specify a specific baseline of requirements, they can't do those estimates. Now, this is a little bit of a crazy story, because if you look closely at your DFARS 252-204-7012 contract clause, it does not specify a revision for your NIST requirements. That's actually the thing that's making you implement the requirements. The language there says implement whatever the most current version is at the time that a solicitation goes out containing the language in DFARS 7012. So it was an anomaly. It got squeaked through, and they technically should not have been able to do that, because you can't estimate what the cost and the impact is if you can't tell me which version of the requirements are going to be required. And so when people talk about the move to 171 Rev 3, you'll have to go through additional rulemaking to update the CMMC program to say, okay, we're going to make everybody implement CMMC Rev 3. They'll update class deviations, and everything will sort of catch up, right? Well, somebody on LinkedIn was this morning being like, why do they publish the revision numbers? This is too slow. The reason why is they have to do these cost estimates. So you won't see the requirements to move to Rev 3 until all the rulemaking catches up, which is why we've been saying it'll probably be 18, 24-ish months, maybe longer, until we see CMMC 3.0 update all the assessment guides. And then DoD updates the class deviation for 7012. Maybe there's a 7012 rule that updates the language, and everything has to sort of catch up, right?
What about that little gift that our friends up north have delivered us?
What's oh yeah, hey, look at that. What's that about?
Oh, there you go. Man, we are
so you got them ready to go here. So if anybody heard the news, so Canada has a program that is CMMC essentially in Canada. It is the CPCSC, and it's exactly the same setup. It is the requirements in 800-171, the requirements in 800-172 for unclassified, sensitive, controlled information in their defense industrial base supply chains. There are 3 levels that are verified. There's a phased rollout. There are external third-party assessors. There's certifications. It's everything the same, just with the maple flag or the maple leaf logo on top of everything, essentially. There's a little bit of a problem, though. The problem is that the most current version of NIST SP 800-171 is 171 Rev 3. And so the CPCSC guide says do 171 Rev 3 requirements. CMMC says do 171 Rev 2 requirements. And there is a sizable delta between those two standards. Currently, we know nothing about agreements on reciprocity between these two programs. It was rumored to exist for a long time, but they're starting their assessments this month. They're starting their assessments in Canada in March, right? They're in their phased rollout right now. And all the updated documentation mentions nothing about reciprocity, nothing about CMMC. So based off of what it looks like, maybe there's some sort of agreement or announcement coming in the future. If you're doing business with both Canada and the United States, you'll have to have 2 different certifications from 2 different accrediting bodies against 2 different revisions of the same standard, which is exactly the nightmare that we wanted to avoid by having the class deviation for DFARS 7012, because CMMC would have said, we're going to do Rev 3, 7012 would have said, we're going to do Rev 2. So if you're just a domestic supplier, you don't have to worry about it. If you're doing anything with Canadian businesses, you got a situation that we're going to have to figure out here, because, yeah, I mean, at the very least, you'd have to pay for 2 different assessments, which sucks. So we'll see what's going to happen, but I have heard nothing about reciprocity agreements from either DoD or Canadian Ministry of Defense.
There's nothing in the rule. There's nothing in the rule at all about it.
The CMMC FAQ does say, if you're an international company, just do what we called out in 32 CFR. And that's like the extent of it. That's it. That's the only real guidance for international companies that I've seen, which is going to be very difficult, because we talk to a lot of international companies and they are nervous.
It's a good thing that the Canadian Defense Industrial Base and the U.S. Defense Industrial Base don't overlap at all. So, it should be a problem.
Nah.
Oh boy. So yeah, we have a podcast coming up where we'll go into the details of the CPCSC baseline, but essentially it's 171 Rev 3. They don't have their CPCSC assessment guide out yet, but the CPCSC control baseline says that it's just going to be 171A revision 3, and until they publish it, just use 171A revision 3. So that is the most updated baseline. The program that the US came up with is now being assessed against the most current baseline and is currently in phased rollout in a different country. So yippee skippy, everybody. God, do with that information what you will.
I want to know what the UK is going to do, because everyone over there is, Cyber Essentials, Cyber Essentials Plus. And I think that they were hoping for reciprocity pretty strongly. And a lot of UK companies that I talk to are like, we don't know what we are going to do. Like, yeah, anyways. Yeah.
I mean, everything that I heard, everything that I heard over the last couple of years when they were talking about reciprocity, people would say, well, the UK uses Cyber Essentials and Australian has the Essential 8 and blah, blah, blah. So CMMC is overbearing. Everything that I heard was exactly like what CPCSC is doing, that the UK, Australia, the Israelis, the Canadian, everybody had their version of 171 that their version of CMMC was going to use. The only question was, would they use their assessors or American assessors or not? The baseline was not really the question, I guess, until now.
Well,
which version of the baseline?
And FedRAMP clouds. Yeah. That's the other huge asterisk.
Huge sticking point.
That huge people overlook, especially with commercial dropping FedRAMP with multi-geo. Like, people are in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, all these companies are looking at, they have data residency requirements in their countries, and all the FedRAMP clouds are in the United States.
So this is interesting. The comment that was just dropped, UK is working with companies like Oracle and making their own compliance. So almost an IaaS infrastructure approach versus more of a SaaS type, like a M365 type.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
And Vicky, bad news. I don't know if you realize or not, but the CUI hotline does not get to give Katie Arrington taskers. That is not how it works.
You got the Katie phone.
Yeah, that's what the red phone goes to. I've been wondering the whole time. Like, what does it actually do?
Surprise, everybody. All right. Well, hey, speaking of fun international conundrums, this is a question we've been getting increasingly on calls over the last couple of weeks. Does Summit 7 support ISO 27001 control environments along with CMMC control assessment compliance environments? What to do?
Yeah, so there is a lot of overlap between ISO 27001 and 800-171 R2. There is not what I wouldn't call it official official support for line item by line item, but the support that we do provide is Rev 2 compliant, CMMC L2 compliant, but we have not done the full mapping to 27001 and driven that all the way through all of our support processes yet. That being said, we are in the process of finishing and going through our own ISO 27001 certification. And then we will look at, how we drive that into our support processes, as part of that process. So today, officially not, there will be a lot, if you took the Venn diagram of the two and overlaid them, there's a lot of overlap. But, we're looking at going there, right? We're doing it internally for Summit 7, and what we do internally for Summit 7 ultimately will largely get pushed into our support infrastructure.
Yeah, back in the day, if anybody remembers, or if anybody wants to go down memory lane, highly recommended weekend read the appendices to NIST SP 800-171 Revision 3. Circa 2005, whenever I had long hair on the high school tennis team. There is an entire appendix talking about how NIST and ISO were going to, there was going to be one ring to rule them all, and they were going to sort of merge both publications into a single international publication, and that never happened. But if you'd like to revisit the dream of a unified international standard between NIST and ISO, it's an interesting appendix to read. Highly recommended. if there's anybody else who's interested in doing that, please DM me, because I've never met anybody who wants to read those things.
You might be the only one.
I would love to talk.
No, Tom up at Secure Controls Framework.
Yeah, for sure.
Tom will do it.
Alrighty, let's see. Okay, so do we offer a turnkey solution? Is there a button I can pay money to press and then all of my worries go away? There's a lot of $6,000 turnkey 6-minute abs solution claims out there. So do we have a 6-minute abs, Scott?
I'm going to leave that one to Daniel. Daniel gets this question all the time.
Come on, guys. So the answer is no. But the answer is we do have solutions like enclaves and things like that we've talked about on the show for quite some time that are very easy to deploy. Now, there's still a fair amount of documentation, SSP, POAM, policy, procedures, et cetera, that need to be filled out and updated by our team. But yeah, we do have fast solutions. However, nothing is turnkey. And the reason I say that is there's something that you are all probably aware on the show called a shared responsibility, a customer responsibility matrix. You've heard these terms before. And there's a lot of responsibility for organizational adoption and organizational follow through that you just have to own. There's just no way for an external party to own it. Even if they're a FedRAMP enclave and you're buying a subscription, there is no such thing as somebody is fully checking the box for you from a turnkey perspective.
Yeah, this is a question that I was having this conversation with our friend Emilio, who's actually on the hotline today. This last week, he was talking about what can a company come and just essentially write a check and have an external provider do. And we had a great conversation about all the responsibilities that just simply can't be outsourced, the decisions that have to be made, the training that has to be done, the processes that have to be followed on a day-to-day basis. There are pieces that doesn't matter how big of a checkbook you have. You cannot outsource some functions within 801.71 or R2 and 801.71a.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. Well, here's a fun one. Does 7.7 offer penetration testing? Do we do pen testing?
We do. Our vigilance team offers pen testing now. So we have an annual pen testing that we, I forget what we actually call it, but there's a new service that we offer as part of our vigilance. And we also do kind of small one-time engagements as well for penetration testing.
Awesome. Yep. Well, here's a fun trivia question for everybody. Let us know in chat. Why isn't pen testing a CMMC level 2 requirement? Does anybody know? So we offer it. It's a great service. It definitely helps with security. It's a CMMC level 3 requirement, but CMMC level 3 is for quite a small number of companies. You would think such a sort of evergreen, constantly referenced security activity would be a sort of universal requirement for protecting data. Why isn't it a level 2 requirement? Jeopardy music.
Yeah, who's going to be the first to answer in the comment thread here?
I won't wait for everybody to put in the chat. Let's see if everybody knows. One answer might be, well, it's not in NIST SP 801.71, and that is correct, but it isn't in CISSP parlance. Not the most correct answer. It's not in SP 801.71, so it's not verified by CMMC level 2, but it's not in SP 801.71 because it's not in the NIST SP 853 moderate baseline. And so the only things that can show up in 171 Rev 2 are the controls that are in the 853 moderate baseline. And that's if they get through the tailoring process of getting parts sliced out of them and chopped out of them, or if they make it into the CUI baseline at all. So if they're in that moderate baseline and then they're determined to be relevant to CUI confidentiality, and then the various parts of the control are determined to be relevant, then they will show up in 801.71, and then they'll be verified by CMMC. So if you want pen testing to be a requirement verified by CMMC, you can't blame CMMC. You got to go through the NIST tailoring process. So when 853 comes up for revision 6, which is crazy to say because we've been doing this for 20 years, then you have to make the case to NIST that it ought to be a moderate baseline control, and then it can filter through and show up for CMMC. So yelling at CMMC for NIST tailoring decisions is not the right place to go. I hear that people say this about pen testing all the time, but that's why.
I may be remembering this incorrectly because it's been a few minutes, but did not the .4, .7, and 1.0 versions of CMMC have pen testing as a requirement?
They sure did.
It was part of the Delta 20, if I remember correctly, right?
They sure did. The Delta 20. So if everybody remembers that, the whole idea behind CMMC 1.0 was to, quote, open the aperture of NIST SP 800-171, because as we've talked about in the past, 800-171 has holes in it on purpose, right? It has gaps in it on purpose. They tailored it to be extremely narrow for data confidentiality, not a holistic cybersecurity baseline. Now, if you have nothing, it's great. But if you're trying to optimize it for all kinds of things, DNS, email protections, pen testing.
That's what I was just about to say. Let's have a moment of silence for the Delta 20.
Yeah. Well, the irony here is that DoD unilaterally tailored controls on top of 800-171 based off what they perceived as their risk. They called it CMMC 1.0. Everybody freaked out. So then they went back and reviewed the program and decided to align it directly to the NIST revisions. And so now we're on 171 Rev 2. The irony is that a lot of the requirements that were in the Delta 20 under CMMC 1.0 are now in 171 Rev 3, which we're not verifying with CMMC because we had to pin it to 171 Rev 2. Wee! This is why I lost my hair, everybody. All righty, let's see. Another interesting question that I've heard a bunch of people asking about recently. I don't know if this is starting to show up in contracts or what the impetus is behind it. Does Summit 7 support work for NIST SP 800-161 supply chain security considerations?
So it's funny. Currently, we don't. So we do have things in our SSP, obviously related to supply chain, but we're looking for a bigger revamp once Rev 3 is fully adopted to really attack that problem, you could say, if we want to even provide a solution, at all during that time, right? So we don't support it necessarily from a we will service it. However, one thing we have launched is our CMMC supply chain program, where we do education around CMMC specifically, but we're not doing risk-based analysis for their supply chain directly. We're just doing more education.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've seen that one come up quite a bit. Another fun weekend read, 800-161, which was really the largest special publication revision and basically the last major project other than the CUI series revision that Ron Ross worked on before he retired. So definitely check out both sides of 800-161.
So kind of as a corollary to that, 888 OT, right? OT and ICS systems, which kind of leads into Ronald's question that he has put in the comment here on CMMs, vision systems, and other equipment. So Daniel, I know that you get this question a lot on this type of manufacturing equipment and OT and ICS systems and how they engage with CMMC.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So I've got several friends in the OT cyberspace, and number one, the amount of exploits happening on like a daily basis, is absolutely insane.
There was just that story that Volt Typhoon was in electrical systems. It was in Massachusetts for 10 months.
For 10 months they were in it. Anyways, CMMC gave OT an out when it comes to cybersecurity because of the definition of specialized assets, right? You get to basically define your own security policies around your OT space without a direct overlay of any actual mandatory controls. So NIST 882, when it was coming out about the OT framework pieces,
82,
is a really good resource to use. And there's several other publications out there on the OT space if you're looking for good guidelines to build your security policies all for OT. But there's some crazy stories out there. I mean, air-gapped OT environments that they saw the vendor sitting in the parking lot, on his laptop configuring remotely, and they walk out to his car and they're like, wait, how are you connected? Oh, I just went in and flipped the cellular antenna on the OT appliance. I'm like, oh, that's not good. That's not an air gap, at least as far as I understand it. And so, yeah,
there's a gap of air between me and what I'm connecting to.
That's right.
Here's another crazy one. And I saw this one actually. I saw this one in working order. Essentially, imperceptible voltage changes to CNC machines can cause variations in the cuts that are being made to a point where the parts will fail under pressure, but completely imperceptible to the naked eye or to any kind of monitoring system that's currently in place.
Shout out to Stuxnet back in the day, where they would have tiny changes to the centrifuges in the nuclear facilities that didn't show up on the monitoring software. And
so to get to Ronald's question specifically, Daniel, on Windows, give a
Yeah, so if you're running these, and it sounds like you're running these outdated versions of Windows in an OT environment space, then yes, you can continue to run them, right? They have to follow a different set of policies through your OT environment. They can be direct attached to these systems. I know some people are still running, Windows 3.1 or, Windows 95, 98. It kind of just goes up the list from there, but they're critical for the actual equipment to work. So as long as you have a governing security policy, you can still have those Windows versions in scope of your CMMC boundary as a specialized asset. However, and this is, Jacob, you posted about this the other day, out of date.
I was smiling in the background. I was getting ready.
I know you are. I know it's a big queue up for you. Out of date Windows environments outside of your OT environment. So we'll call these in your corporate environment, Jacob. Do those have to be up to date? According to NIST 171 Rev 2?
I think this is a great question. This is a great question for Ronald, because he says, do outdated versions of Windows have to be in scope? So really, this is a question. This is a scoping question. And like you said, which asset determination you use can cause the question to go away. You can sort of make all kinds of decisions about things if they're not in scope. And so I would tell Ronald to double check the scoping guidance before you worry about the fact that the operating system might be out of date. But then when you get to, oh God, where'd it go?
So when you while he's looking that up, so if it's OT, it's probably going to fall under specialized asset, which you get to kind of apply your own security policies to those systems, physical, logical, whatever it might be. And then on the other side of it, you have CUI assets, which are more ideally part of your corporate network, you could say. And that's where Jacob's talking about here for basically Windows devices that would be CUI assets.
So let's assume that they are in scope. Right, that you have assets that are in scope, just a standard computer, standard endpoint, right? Yep. Whatever it happens to be, it's running Windows 10. Windows 10 support ends in October of 2024. The big question is, do I have to upgrade the operating system? A lot of people, and if you've been following me on LinkedIn, we've been talking about this basically for the last week, multiple posts and polls and things like that. Let me just put this up front. You should upgrade, right? You absolutely should upgrade. You ought to upgrade. It is the best practice to upgrade. It will help. It is going to be more secure. It will be continued support. It is less risk. There is a million reasons why you should upgrade your system when your Windows operating system goes out of support. End of story. It's not a debate. However, there are reasons why people won't upgrade, can't upgrade, have to delay the upgrade. It could be software, it could be constraints, it could be budget, it could be whatever, right? But you should upgrade. You absolutely should. That being said, actually, let's look at what the requirements say.
Actually,
you're trying to look at NIST SP 171 and say, where in the requirements does it say I absolutely have to upgrade the operating system? And you go all the way down the rabbit hole, you'll find that you can make the case that you do not have to, does not force you to upgrade components that are no longer in support. And you can see this if you look at 171 revision 3, because 171 revision 3 has a requirement that says if you have unsupported system components, they have to be fixed, they have to be upgraded, they have to be mitigated. You have to deal with them. Right. 171 Rev 2 does not have that requirement, because like we talked about with pen testing, the control in NIST SP 853 SA22 unsupported system components wasn't in the moderate baseline back in the day, so it didn't get tailored into 171 Rev 2, so it's not verified by CMMC level 2. Now, that being said, the only way for you to actually comply with the requirement for dealing with vulnerabilities in your systems and things like that, is if you are able to correct system flaws. That's the operative control in 800.171 is 3.14.1. Identify, report, and correct system flaws in a timely manner. A lot of people read this requirement and they go, oh, well, correct system flaws means upgrade operating systems that are no longer in support. That is the easiest thing to do. That is the best thing to do. That is the recommended thing to do. However, there is an entire NIST special publication, NIST SP 840, that talks about dealing with patch management, correcting system flaws. And there's an entire section in this special publication about what they call unpatchable assets and how you can use architecture decisions to correct flaws in the system if you aren't going to upgrade the operating system. Now, are most people going to do that? No. Do we recommend that you do that? No. Are there certain edge cases and situations where you have to do that? Yes. Does it cost more time, money, stress, anxiety, and compliance risk because you have to explain it to your auditor and you got to have a bunch of meetings about it and it's not worth the time? Absolutely. Can you make the case if you read the requirements very closely that you don't have to upgrade? Also, yes, but don't. But don't do that.
And so in addition to upgrading, there is the capability to do extended security updates, ESU. That is a capability that Microsoft does make available. It is expensive, right? And it doubles every year. So I believe year one, it's $60 a device. Year two, it doubles to $120. Year three, it doubles to $240 a device. And then it goes away. I believe after 3 years, you can't get extended security updates any longer. So certainly not, something we would recommend. But it is available in situations where you just have to have it because you can't upgrade to Windows 11 or what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, check out the blog. Our very own Brad Shannon put this together, so you guys should check that out. It's a great read, and you can go from there. All righty, let's see here. Blah, blah, blah. Do we have to do that? I think we talked about this briefly. It came up on Reddit a little while ago. I'm not sure if we actually talked about this last week. How do you bring physical desktop assets into a CUI VDI enclave solution? Can you do that? Is that possible? How do you blend the two worlds? What would you tell somebody if this was just off the top here?
I mean, we call this a hybrid enclave, right?
Yeah, and do very carefully.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Scott.
No, it's called, what we call it internally is a hybrid enclave where you have, on-prem or physical assets that are then looped into what previously was a fully controlled cloud VDI enclave. And you need to do that in some cases because of specialized equipment. You need to do that in some cases for printing. There are reasons why you may need to do this, but it's something that you need to do very carefully. You have to really understand the scope of what you're doing because it is going to have a significant impact on the controls that you have to have in place for ensuring that all of those devices that are brought into your enclave maintain compliance and security. Daniel, what are some of the situations that you've seen beyond printing and specialized equipment?
Printing's a big one. Regulated research has a lot of different types of equipment they need that are network attached or connected. Another one is like USB transfers. So a lot of people still receive information on USBs or have to deliver information in a USB format. And so a lot of those all requiring physical assets. The way that we try and set it up to still maintain the integrity of an enclave is direct join those devices to something like the Microsoft Gov Cloud and not attach them physically to an on-prem Active Directory domain, which leads to a quick, great tie-in question that was posted at 12:44 here, Jacob, that I'll just jump right into. So if all CUI is consolidating to a GCI environment, SharePoint, et cetera, and that environment uses Azure AD Sync or Intra ID Sync, because Microsoft loves renaming everything under the sun, to an on-prem domain, does that bring the local domain environment network into scope? Yes, but not as a CUI asset. It will bring that Active Directory and the sync into Intra ID or Azure AD as a security protection asset, right? So you have to apply all what they call relevant controls to that system, Active Directory, password, complexity, things like that, multi-factor, et cetera. But the device itself, the Active Directory, is not going to be in scope as a CUI asset as long as it's holding just the identity and the the identifiable information of your employees and not that of federal employees, right? There's a little delineation there when it comes to like PII information. So as long as they're just your employees, yes, part of your scope, but very limited in scope. You really just got to look at the primary control families around access control, right? When you're looking to apply relevant controls to that system.
Awesome. Awesome.
So,
alrighty.
So
I was just going to reference the question here from David about level 3. I don't know that I have personally heard of any level 3 assessments taking place by DIBCAT quite yet. Obviously, the L2 certifications have just really started in the last 2 months. And then once you get that, we really only got the certifications. March 7th, I believe, was when the actual final certificates were provided to everybody, that we were waiting on the artwork and what have you to be completed to get the actual certificates. So I believe that you had to have that before you could request an L3 certification assessment by DIBCAC. So we're talking, that's been what, 2 weeks?
Something like that.
Yeah. So I don't know that there would have been any L3 certification assessments by DIBCAT quite yet. Jacob, Daniel, have you guys heard anything like that?
James heard it from the horse's mouth. They have not started.
None happening at this time.
Okay, there you
so
go.
It's good information. Yeah. So everybody's reference, right? CMMC level 3 assesses the requirements in NIST SP 800-172, but you cannot pay a C3 PAO to give you an official level 3 certification assessment. As of right now, only DoD's DIBCAC auditors who work for the Defense Contract Management Agency are authorized to conduct the CMMC level 3 certification assessments. And in order to do those, you have to have gone through and achieved your CMMC level 2 status from a C3 PAO. So there's probably going to be some lag before that gets started. But I'm sure that by the time the first company goes through and gets awarded their level 3, that hopefully the DoD makes a press release, quite a big deal out of it, because it's a significant achievement. It's quite a big jump to go from 171 to 172.
Yeah, if you remember from the rule, they had to estimate cost to go to L3 because 172 was not part of the original DFARS 7012, rulemaking process, right? And if I remember correctly from that rule, it was an estimate of $2.7 million to implement the 172 controls, the 24 172 controls. So it is a significant undertaking to go after that. That being said, James, since you're here, I'll take advantage of you being in the room with us. If you're keeping a backlog of companies that need a L3 certification, would love for you to put Summit 7 on that backlog list.
Yeah, we're ready to go. We have 24/7 monitoring and the ability to support CMMC level 3 as well. So, it'll be exciting whenever that comes out. But yeah, just David, for the fact that you heard somebody say that they're level 3, one of two things is happening. One, they're dealing with outdated information from CMMC 1.0, and they're saying that they're level 3 because under the 5-level model back in the day, 800-171 was assessed by CMMC level 3. Now that we're under,
get that.
Oh yeah,
So
ChatGPT still says it. Don't use it, kids. Just say no to LLMs.
Yeah, they still think it. They're like, I got to be level 3. I'm like, do you know what that means?
Yeah. Yeah. So now under 2.0, but under CMMC, James is going to get mad. It's not technically called 2.0. 171 is assessed at CMMC level 2. So they're either dealing with outdated information or they are lying through their teeth. You could do what I try to do. You could message them individually and ask them what's going on and say, hey, you have an error. And then if they dig in their heels and or don't respond, then shame them in public. So there you go. Your mileage may vary. All righty. Oh, yeah. So Brad's here, our famous blog author for Windows 10 upgrade. So CMMC level 2 is a 6-digit problem and level 3 is a 7-digit problem. There you go, Scott. You got to update your slide.
Got to update the slide.
There's the math.
Whoever told you they were level 3 probably is trying to sell you a 100% solution for $1,900 a month. So, yeah, you got to be careful with the information out there.
Sounds like you might have seen some of those guys out there.
All righty, let's see.
There were some good questions at the beginning of the chat as well, Jacob.
Yeah, let's pull this up and then we can go from there. Let's do this one. This one came up because we were talking to a company very concerned about whether there's any perceptible lag between moving their operations to a full cloud environment versus their very formidable on-prem systems that they have currently in these sort of like high-powered, low latency environments. What's that like?
Yeah, I mean, that depends on what applications you're using, right? And the application architecture. Go ahead, Daniel.
There's several layers of that onion, like Scott was alluding to. It's like, there's your basic network traffic, and a lot of that will be dependent on the throughput of your ISP, right? Kind of from a basic standpoint. There's something called express routes in the Microsoft world, which is a dedicated pipe where you're guaranteed, up and down, right? When it comes to that. So if you're dealing like very, very, very low latency stuff, we probably need to deep dive and do a little bit more research to figure out geographically where you are, what kind of provider you have, if a direct pipe can come to you or not. Or you just run those workloads natively in the cloud. And by that, I mean your local file storage is in the cloud, your virtual desktop is in the cloud. And so the actual latency is basically nothing because it's all running in the same boundary, right? Up there in the cloud. But if you're having to sync things back and forth on-prem, like significantly with very, very low latency, there's definitely some networking we need to sit down and look through to see if it's even viable for you.
Yeah, you would not want to have a VDI infrastructure reaching back to a on-prem data storage location trying to do CAD or something like that. No. You've definitely got to look at your application architecture for sure.
Absolutely.
Alrighty, this was one that came up a while ago. There's a lot of churn and chaos going on in the contracting world. So they said our contract award has been delayed. Can they submit a change order if they suddenly have a different number of users for the various solutions that they were talking to Summit 7 about? Like once they get set up, are they locked in, or how does this just work over time? Like what happens if you have like the number of users changes in an environment? Is this static, or can this adjust?
So it kind of depends on the offering. So there's really two major pieces here in the Summit 7 ecosystem where this might apply. There's your Microsoft Gov licensing. So that's an annual commit. However, let's say you need to buy a license 6 months in because you just added a bunch of people to a contract. That's a prorated amount till the end of your anniversary. So you still keep the same anniversary date, right? And then managed services does have fluctuation where you can grow and shrink up to a point, right? And so there's different tiers and step downs of being able to true down your service with us when it comes to managed services, or true that back up, right? Because if you call us and say we're going to onboard 1,000 people tomorrow, we probably need a little bit more heads up than 24 hours in order to do that. So, but that's kind of the two different offerings where that would actually apply.
Yeah. In that case, I would say reach out to your strategic account manager, and they can help you get that done in the correct way.
Yep.
Let's see. Somebody was talking about latency here, and they said they finished taking SQL 2005, running on an O3 server, upgraded it to 2022, and this was about a 3-week process. It's fully cloud enabled, so it depends on application solution expertise. So
first off, that's incredible that you did that. There is no amount. I mean, you obviously didn't do in-place upgrades like 7 times to get to that version, but hats off to you for being able to do that. I would almost want to talk to you offline just to figure out what all you had to do, but that is incredible that you.
Yeah. Yes. Just email your resume directly to Scott, and then we'll.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I've got a ton of openings right now, so.
So there were some questions in there about policies. There's some questions in there about requirement 3.4.9. But last week we ended off, and somebody had a question about vulnerability scans and whether or not they needed to be privileged. So I want to get to that one, and then we'll have to queue up the other ones for later. So I believe Mitch reached out afterwards. And he was like, "What are you talking about? Why are you talking about? You got to go double check what it says. Why are you talking about 853? Like, just read what it says on the paper and do the thing, right?" Well, there's a bit of a problem because a lot of people will say, do I have to? Do I have to do privileged scans? The word on the street was this was a big consideration because FedRAMP is very specific about privileged scans, and there were people trying to get equivalency and blah, blah, blah. And the words matter. The words matter, right? And so if we look at the requirement for vulnerability scanning in 171, it says scan for vulnerabilities in organizational systems and applications periodically when new vulnerabilities affecting those systems and applications are identified. Scan for vulnerabilities. Where does it say that the scan has to be privileged? It doesn't. If you look at the discussion section of the requirement way down here at the bottom, they say in certain situations, the nature of the vulnerability scanning may be more intrusive, or the system component that is subject of the scanning may contain very sensitive information. Privileged access authorization to select system components facilitates thorough vulnerability scanning. Well, the thing about this is discussion sections are not requirements. This is what the requirement is. This stuff is not adding to the requirements. It can give you extra information, but they say this at the beginning of the document that this is informative. It is not normative requirements. So when you look back at this, you go, well, you would clearly need to have privileged scans in order to do certain things, but I don't have to. You really should upgrade to Windows, whatever the next Windows is after Windows 10, but I don't have to based off the way that the requirement is written. So the first step is to look and see, well, what does 171A say? Because that's where the rubber really hits the road. So if you look at 171A, it says, well, how often I have to do the scans is defined. I'm actually doing the scans in that time period. The scans are performed within the defined period. We're doing them on systems when new vulnerabilities are identified. You're basically breaking down the sentence of the requirements into the steps to verify the various parts of that requirement sentence. Nowhere does this say, make sure that the scans have been privileged scans. So if you only read what's in here, then nobody really knows. So should they be, ought they be privileged scans? Well, if you look at the control in NIST SP 853, it doesn't say. It doesn't say that they have to be privileged. So if we look at where this requirement came from, there's actually a baseline or a control enhancement here that talks about privileged access to vulnerability scanning. This is the problem with tailoring, is they took this privileged access enhancement to the vulnerability scanning control, and they said, well, it should be. People ought to do that. We assume that people will do that, but they didn't write it into the requirement to say that you must do that. I know we're basically quickly over time. So if we look at Rev 3, maybe they corrected it in Rev 3, right? So if you go down this RA55 control enhancement where they talk about privileged access, they should put that language into an individual requirement, right? Well, actually, it's not in a requirement at all. They say that it's ORC, meaning that privileged scanning is going to be covered by a completely different requirement, not even the vulnerability scanning requirement. Which requirements does NIST say are the ones that are going to take care of privileged scanning? Well, if we look at their tailoring chart that they released with Rev 3, they say that it will be addressed by AC 6, 61, 65, 67, 69, 610, and audit 0904. Do those controls say anything about having privileged scans? No, they talk about least privilege. So now we got to go look at the least privilege requirement. So to get to this whole idea, why do you talk about 53 and 53A and 171A? This is why. This is why. Because if the requirement doesn't say it explicitly, then you have to make this case that you really ought to. And if you don't want to make that case, when NIST comes up for their revisions, this is how to tell them you need to tailor that language into the requirement specifically, because you're assuming too much. People will only do exactly what they're required to do in the language of the requirement, especially when it comes down to a budget decision. So that's a brief crash course in the process of jumping back and forth between all of these documents.
Yeah. And as we close here, I just want to make it clear that, Summit 7 and our vulnerability scanning, we do privileged access vulnerability scanning. So we believe it's important, provides significant security, benefits beyond unprivileged.
That is not the position that we would take for our own operations. That's not the position that we would recommend. But this is why I'm always like, actually, you got to look at what it says in 53A, because there's helpful information in there that really ought to be in there. So there you go. So we'll get to the other controls that people mentioned. Anything that we didn't get to in the comments, we'll queue up for next week. If you're finding this video afterwards, you can always leave comments below. You can leave it in the chat. You can leave it on LinkedIn. You can send us DMs. Check us out on CUIHotline.org. You can fill out the form and leave a question on there. You can call the number and leave a message there, and then we'll add it to the show. We got Summit 7 Live coming up next week. We got CS2 coming up. Scott's everywhere all the time, always, so you'll see him out on the road. We're doing this every Friday. I'll get the time zone right next week. We got a podcast every Thursday. We got a bunch of other content coming out. So like, subscribe, tell your friends, and we'll see you next week.
Have a good one, guys.
Have a great weekend.